This week's video is brought to you by Arora, Age of Desolation, which is a brand new D&D 5e campaign setting from Ghostfire Gaming. The story of Arora revolves around 5 apocalyptic realms, each made in the image of the Dragon Lord which rules over them. Arora is jam-packed with new mechanics for both players and GMs, including new exploration and survival systems, because to save Arora, first you've got to survive the environmental hazards and the monsters that live there. There's a new and improved character creation system, which I'm really excited by. No two PCs will be the same in Arora. Pick the traits and attributes of your character from a slew of different abilities that you kind of slot in to create your own unique individual. Advantage has been revolutionary for 5e, but this allows players and the GM, if they wish, to choose other bonuses aside from just getting the 2d20 and pick the highest when they get to roll with advantage. Just buy it! Just buy it, all right? Hello, my name is Ben Byrne, and I still remember the first ever dungeon I created for D&D 5e. I still remember the very first dungeon that I ever designed entirely by myself for my first ever D&D campaign. And though it's quite a few years old now, I think it still holds up today in demonstrating some fundamental dungeon design concepts and techniques that I want to share with you today, especially if you're someone who hasn't yet designed your first dungeon and you want to know how to get started. There are 5 basic tips that I want to give you in designing your very first dungeon, and they are: number 1, to choose the theme of your dungeon. What is, in a sentence, the story that you want your players to experience as they explore through the dungeon you've created? Number 2, choose your layout. Create your layout. Get down and sketch it out. It doesn't have to be big and complex, and if it is your very first dungeon, you don't really need more than maybe 4 to 8 spaces total. Number 3, and this one's probably the most important one, always provide a second choice to the players wherever they are within the dungeon. I'll explain what that means a little bit more later, but for now, just remember that the player should always have options about how to proceed through the dungeon and not a single laid out path. Number 4 is to then fill the dungeon once you've got that basic layout, and you should fill it with ideally at least 1 trap and or obstacle, at least 1 or 2 combat encounters, at least 1 opportunity for social encounters ideally, and at least 1 opportunity for exploration where the party are rewarded for looking around. And finally, and this is going to introduce just a little bit of complexity to the dungeon, allow the dungeon to react to the player characters dynamically. It shouldn't be a static place that never changes. Even if the players aren't in the room that changes at the time, their actions somewhere else in the dungeon have caused a change to occur. Monsters move from one room to another, a chamber collapses because the party knocked out a pillar in another room, something like that. In the This first tip is designed to help you quickly fill your dungeon with interesting things and help you decide the layout for it, because the layout of a tower is probably going to be different from a network of caves. Who lives in this dungeon? What is the purpose of this dungeon? Is this some sort of creature's lair, or is it an outpost, something where the creatures are able to use it to quickly attack their enemies? The first dungeon I ever created was themed around an encampment of gnolls who had created a fortification at the base of a hill, on top of which there was a ruined tower in which they were squatting. Maybe you decide your dungeon is a cave filled with bandits close to the road where they can stage their raid. Maybe it's a crypt that's filled with ghouls and other undead, or perhaps it's a series of tunnels and grottos filled with plant creatures and fae. Try not to go too big on the first dungeon you're ever going to create. Instead of creating a giant castle filled with enemy soldiers, or maybe a battalion of orcs, maybe it's just a watchtower or an encampment, a fortification, something that only has about 4 to 8 areas in it in total. Step number 2 is to create the layout of your dungeon. And this is the fun step where you can literally grab pen or pencil and paper and sit down and draw out what you want your dungeon to look like. You might just draw a couple of circles and say, here's a room here, and this connects to this room, and this connects to this room. And in your mind, you know what it is that you're creating, and you can describe it to the players. But if you don't want to take the time to make a meticulous map, you don't have to. So, for example, with my Gnoll lair, like I said, they're camping at the base of a little hill, which has a ruined tower on the top of it. So here's the hill, and here's the encampment, which is at the base of the hill, and they've erected a palisade around the outside of their encampment that has wooden spikes coming off of it to make it really hard for enemy combatants to be able to invade the camp. There's an entrance here into the camp area, and there's also a cave opening that goes under the hill. And this goes into an area that was once a basement for the tower, but now it's like almost like a ruined cave. It's half collapsed down, so maybe it's not a perfect circle. It's kind of a little bit misshapen. There's some stairs out of this area which circle around and go up to what was once the ground floor of the tower on top of the hill, but now the tower's collapsed. That area is open air now, and it's like the high walls of the tower around it kind of keep it contained, but this is where the Gnoll Pack Lord holds court. And down in the basement area, I'm going to put one more smaller adjacent room over here. Maybe it's a storage room for the Gnolls. Maybe it's where they keep their bodies of the victims that they've had. It's like cold storage for Gnolls. Tip number 3, always provide a second choice. So I was pretty happy with the layout of my Gnoll encampment, but I have a mantra when it comes to dungeon design, which is asking myself, is there a second choice? The experience of playing Dungeons and Dragons is making choices between one story path and another, making choices between one literal dungeon path or another, making a choice between which attack to use during combat. That's what the essence of playing a game is making choices and seeing how the outcome unfolds. When I'm designing my dungeons and I'm doing the geographical layout, I ask myself, is there a second choice at any given point within the dungeon to make sure that the players feel like they can branch out and explore where they want to explore rather than being led through a linear series of chambers that unfold for them as they progress through. So when I look at my Gnoll encampment, really there isn't any second choices here. There's a small side room off over here, but really the players are funneled from the entrance into the Gnoll encampment through the basement of the tower and up to the top of the hill where they'll face the Pack Lord. There aren't many or really any second choices here. I'm going to add a secret tunnel here. This secret tunnel connects to the side room, and it's ancient. Not even the Gnolls know that it's there. It was an old escape tunnel from when this tower functioned properly, and it's mostly collapsed now. The entrance to it is hidden a little ways away from the hill, and the player characters can discover it by investigating the area rather than charging up to the Gnoll camp. This provides the players a second choice, a second way to tackle the dungeon. And it also makes this basement room here inside of the hill a bit of a nexus for the rest of the dungeon. It provides a second choice itself. If the players enter here from the encampment, they can choose whether to go up the stairs to face the Pack Lord, or they can see what's in this little side room if there's anything there that is of interest to them. If the players come through from the secret tunnel and enter into the tower's basement, then they can choose whether to move out into the Gnoll encampment or up the stairs to face the Pack Lord. Asking yourself whether there's a second choice shouldn't be a cudgel that you beat yourself with, however. You don't need to provide a second choice in every single room of the dungeon if it doesn't make sense to, especially in your first dungeon where you're just creating something relatively small that's only, as we've discussed, 4 to 8 rooms big. There's no real second choice once the players have chosen to enter the Gnoll encampment. The only way forward is going into the basement of the tower, but that's kind of fine. The choice that they made was to enter the Gnoll encampment and not use the secret tunnel. Fill the dungeon like a jam donut's filled with jam. At this point, you might want to draw yourself a dungeon with a bit more fidelity, a bit more detailed if you want to. You certainly don't have to, but I did a more detailed version of my Knoll dungeon back in the day. This is actually the original image that I drew of it, that I took a photo of back at the time. And recently I've also done an incarnate version so that you can see very clearly how this dungeon is laid out if you're watching this video. What did I fill this dungeon with? Well, challenge yourself to use a variety of encounters, including at least one trap and or obstacle, at least one but probably several combat encounters, at least one opportunity for a social encounter in your dungeon, and also exploration encounters or rewarding your players for choosing to explore the dungeon rather than just rushing to the end. So a trap. I put a trap here in the secret tunnel. You can see that it's like a rock which lays across the tunnel. It's actually possible for like a halfling or a gnome to squeeze underneath this rock, but if it's lifted to make room for others, then the tunnel might cave in. And I quite like this trap because A, it's an organic trap. It wasn't something that was deliberately set by the gnolls. It's just happened as the tunnel has collapsed over time. And B, the players can see this trap. It's not hidden from them. It's not a gotcha. Basically, they can see that the stone is blocking their path, and if they start to try to lift it, then they can feel the walls and the roof of the chamber start to sort of shake and crumble. So the players are choosing to engage with this dangerous trap rather than being surprised by it. I've also included several combat encounters. If you're including combat encounters in your dungeons, try to use a variety of stat blocks. If it's a crypt with undead in it, use zombies, ghouls, wights, and some incorporeal undead. In this situation, I've put some ordinary gnolls here in the encampment where most of the gnolls are, and then here in the gnoll cold storage, this little side room connected to the secret tunnel, I've got a gnoll flesh tearer from Xanathar's Guide because he's in there munching on all the tasty people. And up here in the final area, in the ruins of the old tower, I have a gnoll pack lord who is bodyguarded by witherlings. So there's plenty of opportunity to fight with these gnolls. Try to include at least one social encounter, which I'm going to admit was pretty hard with a dungeon filled with gnolls because mostly they just want to munch on bones and not really have philosophical conversations. But I've decided that the gnoll pack lord wants to talk to the party and taunt them and try to intimidate them. So ensuring that there's at least an opportunity to roleplay, even if it's most likely going to end in a combat, is totally fine. Just giving the players a moment where the bard or some other charismatic character can shine is enough. And of course, reward your players for exploring your dungeon. The players will be rewarded for exploring before they've even entered this particular dungeon because it might provide them the opportunity to discover the secret tunnel if they investigate the area around the outside of the dungeon. But once they've come into the dungeon, if they've come through the gnoll encampment into the basement area, if they choose to look at that side room at the gnoll cold storage, which is a mouthful, let me tell you, gnoll cold storage. If they decide to look at the gnoll cold storage, there's the valuables of the villagers who were killed still on their bodies because the gnolls don't care about gold. And so the party can recover that and are rewarded for exploring. I've also decided that there is a chest beneath the pack lord's throne. So once they're defeated or driven off, the party might be able to recover more valuables and are rewarded for using investigation or perception checks and looking around their surroundings. So I'm pretty happy with this dungeon as it is right now, but I'm going to do one more step, step 5, which is to create some reactions that your dungeon is going to have dependent on how the players choose to explore it. And that might sound a little bit weird. I'll explain what I mean in a moment, but basically the purpose of this is to make the dungeon feel like a real living space and not a series of static rooms that only come alive when the player characters enter them. There's a gnoll in area 1 who has a war horn and is standing sentry so that people can't just wander into the gnoll camp willy-nilly. If the gnoll sees enemies off in the woods away from the hill or they become alert, they'll blow the war horn, and this makes the entire gnoll encampment aware that enemies are close by. This also causes the gnoll in area 4 in the gnoll cold storage, the flesh tearer, to move from area 4 down into area 3 because now they're alerted to the presence of somebody there, and the pack lord is also now alert that danger is nearby. Having the dungeon react in this way allows your players to possibly leverage the dungeon's reactions to their advantage or possibly even their disadvantage. For example, if the players choose to just charge up and attack the Gnoll encampment front on, they kill that first Gnoll standing sentry, but he manages to blow the war horn. Now they're running into an encampment filled with alert Gnolls. And when they move into Area 3, as they progress through the dungeon, now they have to deal with the Flesh Tearer because they're alert and in that room. If the horn hadn't been blown, the Flesh Tearer would still be in Area 4 and there'd be an opportunity for the players to sneak past them. On the other side of things, maybe the players have discovered the secret tunnel and they've found the Gnoll Flesh Tearer inside of that Gnoll cold storage inside Area 4, but the Flesh Tearer hasn't noticed them yet. They have one party member who goes back out the tunnel, reveals themselves to the sentry blows the war horn, and that lures the Flesh Tearer out of Area 4 down into Area 3, and now the player characters have created a bit of space for themselves. They can get ready by coming out of the tunnel and maybe ambush the Flesh Tearer in Area 3 instead. Dungeons shouldn't be static places. There should be opportunities for your party to manipulate the dungeon to their advantage and, as mentioned, perhaps to their detriment as well if they are careless. Maybe the players are able to flood a room in the dungeon if there's a river that flows through the center of the dungeon by rerouting the water, or maybe they're able to knock down a wall of the dungeon that's particularly weak. In any of these ways, the players could force the dungeon to react to their playstyle and how they want to interact with it, which makes it feel more alive and makes it feel like the players have more of an effect on the dungeon than just moving from room to room, killing everything that's inside of it. And that was the first dungeon I ever designed for my first D&D campaign. I hope taking you through the steps of how that dungeon was created will be helpful for you if you're designing your first ever dungeon. Let me know if you liked this video, because I'd like to do more videos about making bigger and more complex dungeons. Leave me a comment down below, like, subscribe, do all the things, all the good stuff, because we're going to be back next week with more videos about formidable monsters and running games of Dungeons & Dragons 5e.